Eyewitnesses recall a chamber electrified by a hush, not by shouts. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. King Charles emerged, his face streaked with tears. His whispered words, heard by few, still lingered in the air. "It is finished." Beyond those ornate doors, the foundations of royal power seemed to tremble and begin to crumble. After decades of steady hands and unwavering tradition, how did the monarch's resolve collapse so suddenly, right before the nation's eyes? Now, the closely guarded secrets of royalty appear to be surfacing, threatening to reshape the House of Windsor forever. If you want to keep up with every twist in this historic drama, make sure you subscribe and stay informed. In that quiet, fragile moment, the truth was undeniable inside those ancient walls. Something fundamental had broken open. No rulebook and no ritual could hide it. For those watching from the palace's golden-lit corridors, seeing Charles step out of the famous Clarion Council chamber was unforgettable, unprecedented, and raw. Charles, who so often seemed unbreakable under the heavy weight of his family's legacy, now looked as if he was collapsing inward. His posture revealed the strain of something truly overwhelming. The words, "It is over," didn't ring out. Instead, they slipped quietly from his lips, more an admission than a declaration, half-intended and painfully honest. Nearby, Anne stood motionless. Her body was still, but her eyes overflowed with silent turmoil. Though she didn't speak, her face revealed 1,000 questions she couldn't bring herself to ask. The king's subdued voice signaled an ending, one no one in the chamber was prepared to face. It was an ending that had gathered quietly, like thunder beneath their feet. What happened next broke all routine. Panic swept through the marble corridors. Palace staff rushed into action, and their frantic movements only made the seriousness more obvious. Aides flooded into the council wing, quickly barricading the hallway. Each step was heavy with the urgent realization that something monumental had just slipped away from their control. Heavy doors slammed shut. Confidential orders were exchanged in hushed tones. Outside, the press was kept at bay, hearing only gentle reassurances that the official meeting had simply ended a bit earlier than planned, nothing more. But inside the palace, anxiety hung thick in the air. Charles's abrupt exit had done more than disrupt royal proceedings. It shattered the fragile illusion that he still held the composure and certainty expected of the crown. Those who caught a glimpse of his stricken face knew whatever decision was made in that council room, it had pushed him past a point of no return. Soon after, Catherine and William appeared in the corridor. Their silence spoke volumes, far more than any crafted statement ever could. The tension in their faces didn't point to conflict. Instead, it reflected the weight of witnessing a moment that could never be reversed. Moving slowly and deliberately, they held on to their composure, though it was clear they were under strain. Anyone paying attention could sense it. They now carried a truth so profound it would take time before the world understood its magnitude. The doors to the council chamber stayed firmly shut, as if the truth within was too powerful, too dangerous to release into the world outside. Rumors spread quickly. What was said behind closed doors? Which crucial document made its way onto the table? And in that tense moment, what drove Charles to finally let go and admit defeat? In the hallways, aides hurried at a frantic pace. Some clutched crimson folders, each stamped with a rare and ominous label, Protocol Seraphine. This classification is used only when the monarchy itself feels threatened. No explanation was given for why these files surfaced on this particular day, or why extra security guarded them as they moved through the gilded corridors. But one thing was clear: their arrival at the council meeting marked a seismic shift, sure to send shockwaves far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. In the midst of all this uncertainty, a final twist made the story even more intriguing. Queen Camilla had not attended the meeting at all. Whether it was by her own decision or due to other circumstances, her absence was impossible to ignore. It left a tangle of unanswered questions hanging in the air. Soft rumors slipped through the corridors, sparking whispers about loyalty, the race to inherit power, and secrets sown deep within the royal family. The true spark behind Charles's unraveling was still hidden, lurking just beneath the surface. For months, something had quietly been festering within the monarchy, and now it was finally starting to break through, threatening to unleash chaos that the family had tried so hard to keep locked away. Before the real cause of the king's downfall is revealed, we need to step into the secret conflict simmering inside the palace walls. This wasn't just a single event, it was a transformation, a subtle and deliberate rise of one figure above all others. The public admired Catherine for her poise and charm, but inside the royal chambers, the shifting tides couldn't be ignored. Power quietly began to shift, moving in a way that few noticed, but none felt it more deeply than Charles himself. After his health scare, a strange silence settled over the monarchy. It wasn't the calm of healing, but that uneasy quiet when important decisions start to slip away from those who once held them. As the king retreated behind thick curtains to recover, Catherine stepped forward, entering spaces once reserved only for the reigning monarch. She sat in on high-level briefings, appeared in top-secret discussions, and eventually found herself at the very center of Windsor's strategic war rooms. At first, her involvement stood out as something exceptional. But before long, it became part of the daily routine, her presence woven into the fabric of this new order. What once seemed like a simple move to keep things stable soon turned into something much bigger, a complete restructuring of authority. Then, late one night, news began to spread. A mysterious document had arrived under a shroud of secrecy. It was encased in velvet and headed straight for the Windsor archives. The title was equally intriguing: Appendix Windsor 4th. Very few people know what's really inside. But for those with inside knowledge, it's clear this was no ordinary contingency plan. They say the document granted sweeping powers. It enabled real foundational reform extending far beyond mere ceremonial duties. Catherine's decision to take charge of that document marked a stark and unsettling milestone in the royal narrative. Tradition had long dictated that once Charles left the scene, the royal operations would come to a standstill, but this time the opposite happened. Momentum shifted, and it shifted decisively toward her. The inner workings of power began to change, with Catherine now at the center. Advisors who once revolved around Charles started to realign their loyalties, gradually drawn by Catherine's growing influence. Those who upheld the palace's traditions, the courtiers, the intermediaries, the keepers of secret records, quietly stopped waiting for Charles's signature. Instead, they began to watch for the quiet authority in Catherine's poised gestures. She made no speeches and staged no outward shows of taking power. Her command was silent but unmistakable, tightening her grip on an institution that once put tradition above all else. By the time Charles appeared again, he was no longer the monarch everyone remembered, but a fading figure in an establishment that now revolved around someone else. And then, away from the public eye, deep within the palace's quietest halls, everything changed. In a hidden room, shielded from the official record and far from the world's gaze, a secret ceremony took place. Entry was forbidden to almost everyone, allowed only for a trusted circle who could bear witness. Within that intimate gathering, a new title was announced, one the monarchy had never used before: executive. The word echoed, setting itself apart from queen, consort, or regent. It didn't just mean ruling, it spoke of legacy, of the authority to create, to revoke, and to reshape the very future. This title was chosen with care, its announcement deliberate. Once spoken, everything changed. Beyond those walls, Camilla slowly faded from view. Her once packed schedule, filled with events and influence, began to shrink. Invitations disappeared. Appointments vanished. The phone, once busy, grew quiet. Journalists were the first to take notice: her absence from a state dinner, Catherine's prominent seat beside William at a military tribute, while Camilla remained out of sight. No explanations were given, but the shift in power was unmistakable. Camilla's sense of importance faded quietly, almost without notice. Those around her did nothing to stop it. Anne didn't speak up or take a public stand. Instead, she responded in a much deeper way. She unlocked files that Charles had hidden away for years. By doing this, Anne and Catherine formed a discreet partnership. Anne offered Catherine not just information, but real authority. Her actions showed an urgent conviction, more than just loyalty. Anne sensed the changes coming long before anyone else did. With her decision, she set in motion the final unstoppable shift within the royal family. As Catherine rose, someone else had to step down. This wasn't fate, it was the result of a direct challenge. Camilla didn't lose her title, but the power she once held slipped away. Behind closed doors, far from any watchful eye, Queen Camilla's story came to a quiet close, not with a grand announcement, but with silence. What really happened in that room? Who chose to look the other way as everything changed? Inside the secure chambers of the Clarion Council, an urgent meeting unfolded. Camilla's name wasn't on the guest list, a pointed omission that sent shockwaves through the palace. The agenda was shared only with a select few senior aides. It was uncompromising and clear: a complete review and transformation of royal executive duties, all under the rules of Protocol Clarion II. This operation was swift and precise, meant to quietly remove authority. There would be no official charges, no dramatic confrontations, just a profound silence. When it was time to vote, the result was already inevitable. Prince Edward, known for his fairness, spoke with surprising bluntness: "It is time we stop pretending she is still in control." Princess Anne, as steady and determined as ever, made her choice for one reason alone: the stability of the crown. There was no opposition. No one stepped forward to defend Camilla. The council was united in its understanding this decision wasn't driven by scandal or disgrace. It was about survival. It was inevitable. Inheritance and sentiment no longer mattered here. For the council, power had become a tool, a precise instrument, used without looking back, and Camilla was no longer seen as the right person to wield it. But the turning point of the meeting didn't come from Edward or Anne, it came from William. Throughout, he ignored Camilla's loyal advisors, never once meeting their eyes. When one of them tried to stop the restructuring, William stayed silent. His steady focus on the agenda made it clear their opinions no longer mattered in the monarchy's new order. Once the unanimous vote was cast, William stood just long enough to say, "We move forward now." There was no sign of triumph or regret, only the relentless force of duty. Outside the council room, the response was swift. Plans changed in an instant. Several of Camilla's public appearances were quietly cancelled. Press releases were pulled back before they even reached the public. Prepared remarks were quietly gathered, locked away, or refiled for someone else. Overnight, the palace's official schedule changed, now highlighting Catherine in roles that once belonged to Camilla. There was no announcement to explain the new order. None was needed. The silence said everything. This wasn't a public loss of dignity, but a slow disappearance, carried out through paperwork and protocol. Deep within the palace, a staff member was overheard muttering words that now echo through every hallway. "This is not exile, it is erasure." That evening, unaware of the seismic meeting, Camilla reportedly asked why her speech notes for the Commonwealth address hadn't arrived. The aide hesitated. In that heavy pause, everyone knew her name had quietly been removed from the latest plans. Though she still wore the crown, the machinery had moved on without her, closing off every path she once controlled, all with an unspoken certainty. But there was a twist Charles never saw coming. This decision would unknowingly begin to unravel his own legacy, along with Camilla's. Behind the royal mask, Charles carried burdens that would not fade. When a confidential letter never meant to see the light of day suddenly surfaced at the council session, its contents deeply unsettled him. This was a lesson in monarchy. If a king leaves his words in ink and fails to erase the proof, fate will eventually bring them to light. What began as a routine council agenda quickly shifted into something intensely personal. Princess Anne produced a sealed envelope from the Balmoral archives. The hush that followed in the chamber wasn't out of respect, but from a very real sense of foreboding, a shared anxiety that something momentous was about to unfold. This letter, written by Charles just after his own coronation, had been hidden away in a private safe, marked only with the words Regency Contingency, but inside there was no plan of action. Instead, it was a letter surrendering the throne. The language was unmistakable. The words carried a weight that left the room utterly silent. If the house fractures, let it be rebuilt by her. No one needed to hear the missing name. Everyone knew exactly who her referred to: Catherine. She had always trailed behind, but now she stood on the threshold of power, unexpectedly armed with both his blessing and undeniable proof. Anne stood composed and resolute. She didn't read the letter aloud. Instead, she placed it gently on the council table and said, "This is not an act of disloyalty, it is an act of clarity." In that moment, the gathering stopped being just a formality. It became a moment of truth. Charles, who had sat in uneasy silence for much of the meeting, stood as the seal was broken. His voice, normally unwavering, faltered just once. It was enough to crack his carefully guarded facade. "She was right all along," he murmured. The admission was barely audible, but its weight echoed through the chamber, thick with history. For a sovereign who had always valued restraint and honored the weight of tradition, those words shattered the careful facade he'd built, revealing a much more fragile truth beneath. This was more than simply acknowledging Catherine's rise. It was the clear acceptance of his own slow unraveling. That letter, written in a brief moment of doubt, may have seemed safely hidden, its confessions never intended to be known. But now it had resurfaced, not as a weapon to dethrone him, but as undeniable proof of what he had always sensed, yet never dared to say out loud. Charles reportedly tried to slip away during the meeting, quietly telling his aides he was no longer needed. But the council insisted he stay, not out of respect, but because they were required to. His presence was still critical to formalize the sweeping changes already underway. In that tense silence, Charles lost his royal immunity. He was no longer the ruler, just a bystander, confined by the very institution he once shaped but could no longer guide into the future. The crown, instead of protecting him, now made the consequences unmistakably clear. And yet that letter sat in silent judgment at the center of the council table, untouched, but impossible to ignore. Its origin, written in Charles's own hand, left no room for doubt or denial. The council had seen into his conscience, and now, driven by necessity, they would set a new course for the monarchy. Charles remained there, his presence required, as one voice rose, a voice that would change everything. William stood, not with anger, but with a calm and steady sense of duty, and spoke to his father. The crown cannot be divided. His words were not a rebellion, but a declaration of responsibility. That, more than anything, was Charles's greatest breaking point. For years, the royal family tried to balance their ancient traditions with the demands of the modern world. But in that historic meeting, inside the Clarion Council chamber, all doubt vanished. William's statement wasn't a plea, it was a command, delivered clearly and with purpose. He reached for a rarely used constitutional safeguard, the clause of singular sovereign function. It's reserved only for the moments when the monarchy's unity is truly at risk. That clause worked like the crown's silent alarm, and William had just set it off. His demeanor was calm and steady as he laid the facts on the table. The current system kept roles hidden in the shadows, muddied loyalties, and made leadership uncertain. The experiment of sharing authority between king and consort had shaken the institution's sense of direction. Charles, already worn down by doubt and now uncovered by these revelations, could find nothing to say in his defense. That silence said everything. Even the king seemed to realize he had reached the limits of his power. Sensing the moment was final, William pressed on. His voice carried the weight of legacy and responsibility. Either you take command or I will. In that instant, the heir no longer spoke as a loyal child, but as a ruler stepping into a new era, someone who was finished waiting. Across the chamber, Princess Anne offered a small but meaningful nod. In the thick, expectant air, her silent agreement spoke volumes. She had already cast her lot with the rising power, her name on documents, her decisive votes, her carefully chosen silences. By standing behind William's statement, she granted it undeniable legitimacy, quietly putting an end to any spark of dissent within the council. There were no objections, no raised hands in protest. What everyone had whispered behind closed doors was now laid bare for all to see. The old hierarchy was crumbling, its influence shifting without a single formal announcement. Charles stood motionless, as if suspended in a moment between past and future. Slowly, his right hand moved toward the polished council table. This was the same hand that had once signed laws, named regents, and knighted leaders across continents. Yet now, it trembled as he surrendered. He rested it on the polished wood, silent, his retreat shown in gesture, not in words. Long moments passed before Charles finally broke the silence. His voice was hushed, thick with something deeper than surrender. "Then it is over," he whispered. There was no bitterness, no brokenness, just a painful, unvarnished truth. He didn't stay for pleasantries or ceremony. Quietly, he rose, turned, and left the council behind. No one followed, no one intervened. The chamber hung in silence, suspended in the wake of his words. In that pivotal moment, it wasn't just a king departing, it was a man who had given his all to the monarchy, only to realize the time had come to pass on his legacy. But beyond those heavy doors, a new reckoning was already building, one wrapped in sapphire. Catherine walked calmly down the hallway, wearing Queen Elizabeth's sapphire brooch, a jewel rich in history and famously off-limits to Camilla. Catherine said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence and that brooch spoke volumes. Each footstep carried a sense of purpose, every glance its own silent judgment, and no one dared to step in. The hallway wasn't quiet just out of respect. It was a silent admission that things had changed. Minutes after Charles left, his final words still lingering like the echo of a lost hymn, Catherine arrived and stood beside Princess Anne. Together they embodied strength and heritage. They didn't speak, but the mood in the room changed the moment they stood together. This moment wasn't just about Charles's departure, but more than anything, this was about Catherine stepping into a world that once felt completely off-limits. Under the bright corridor lights, the sapphire brooch sparkled not just as a decoration, but as a statement. That piece of jewelry had always held meaning. For Queen Elizabeth, it was a subtle way to express her trust and intentions, no words needed. Over the years, the brooch rested on the Queen's shoulder during crucial moments, when the nation faced turmoil, when the monarchy endured constitutional challenges, and during those quiet, powerful shifts in leadership. For years, everyone inside the palace followed an unspoken rule. The sapphire brooch was never given to Camilla. It stayed hidden out of reach until now. Today, it rested on Catherine's shoulder. She didn't flaunt it, she wore it with purpose. The message was clear and deliberate. There were no grand announcements, but everyone understood the meaning right away. William walked a step behind Catherine, then moved beside her, not leading but standing with her. This small change said everything. It marked a new order, one decided not by old tradition, but by what's happening now. As the pair walked down the hallway, aides quietly stepped aside, giving them a passage never before granted to a consort. The air was tense, a silent recognition that history was unfolding in that very moment. Then came the unmistakable sign. The council members offered a small, unified bow, a humble gesture reserved for the one who holds absolute authority. The royal guards moved in perfect sync, dipping their heads as Catherine passed by. This was royalty's most subtle yet final acknowledgement, a transfer of power that needed no permission, only presence. Outside the main doors, journalists found themselves trapped behind new security barricades that had appeared just hours earlier. They waited, cameras at the ready, hoping for a quote or perhaps a glimpse of the king. But what they saw was even more revealing. Catherine stepped into the lights, standing alone. Her silhouette was captured by every camera lens. She was the only one in view. William and Anne stayed out of sight, their roles clearly in the background. And Camilla, she was notably absent. Her usual ceremonial presence was missing. Those hoping for answers from Clarence's house quickly realized nothing would be said today. Soft rumors drifted through the palace walls. Camilla had been seen in a secluded part of the building, quietly led by private security, far from the public eye, and far from any official farewell. There was no dramatic scene because none was needed. Camilla's quiet departure from the spotlight followed the rules, subtle, never theatrical. Yet, her absence echoed through the palace and the press corps, louder than any official announcement could. Catherine never needed to put on a display of power. Her presence alone filled the room, grounding a nation that was already beginning to reshape itself around her. As Catherine stepped into the spotlight, the weight of history swept over her. A single diary, one voice carried through time, and a legacy carefully protected. Inside a velvet pouch was Queen Elizabeth's own handwritten note. She wrote it 3 years before her death and sealed it with her personal insignia. This wasn't a message for Charles, but for the council and for Catherine herself. Inside there were just 7 words. Words now echoing through every level of power. If she earns it, give it all to her. After the quiet turning point in the council chamber, a message was revealed. It carried a deeper current, one that had stayed hidden and unclaimed until this very moment in history. Princess Alexandra moved with quiet precision, retrieving the Queen's note from its secret place in the Windsor Blue Room. This message, carefully logged in a confidential archive known only to Elizabeth and Alexandra, had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for its time. Its arrival now was no accident. It was planned, exact, and calculated. The note was dated years before Camilla's official investiture, long before the titles or the surge of public spectacle. At that time, the royal household was still adjusting to change. Unity was fragile, but it hadn't broken quite yet. Elizabeth saw it all coming: the looming self-interests, the confusion that inheritance would create, and the endless test of loyalty. Her letter was brief, stripped of any sentiment but devastatingly clear. In just 7 words, she changed the course of succession. The Queen never said, if she is named or if Charles makes the choice. Instead, she wrote, if she earns it. There were no guarantees. The title of Queen would not simply be handed over. It had to be seized, justified, and carried with pride. Catherine had met every challenge set before her. When the contents of the note were revealed, it was Anne, not Alexandra, who stood up to deliver Queen Elizabeth's words. As the Queen's most cherished daughter, Anne became the living link between the old order and the new. For the first time, she spoke the message aloud in that council chamber. The change in the room was immediate and unmistakable. No one questioned it, and no one objected. The Queen's prediction had come true, not with ceremony, but through steady determination. Catherine hadn't seized power with demands or ultimatums. Instead, she quietly withstood challenge after challenge, becoming the steady anchor, holding firm as Charles faltered and Camilla faded from view. But the most surprising detail? Charles had never even seen the note. Palace sources confirmed he didn't know it existed. Elizabeth had deliberately placed her trust in Alexandra and Anne, making sure the message was kept from her son. This note wasn't written for Charles. It was meant for the monarchy itself, for those entrusted with protecting its true spirit. Now, with that message out in the open, the council acted quickly and decisively, leaving no room for doubt. Camilla's official procedures, once protected by the Shared Authority Pact, were swiftly and unanimously cast into history. Her name would remain in the formal archives, but her influence over royal matters vanished instantly. There was no press release, no televised announcement, but inside the palace walls, the change was unmistakable. Within just hours, Camilla's emblem disappeared from internal documents, and her royal seal was removed from all future agendas. In her place was Catherine's signature, a symbol of a legacy that had quietly waited for its moment. The Queen's note was more than just headline news. It was an unbreakable directive, obeyed not out of fear but because everyone knew it carried undeniable truth. As a result, the monarchy shifted direction once more. not with upheaval but with the calm of new revelation. Yet beneath all the ceremony and signatures was a personal story, one of a man struggling with his loss. Alone, the king retreated to his private chambers, the heavy silence following him in. There were no attendants gathered around, no supportive partner, not even a son nearby. Only the stark truth remained that the crown had changed hands without ever asking for his consent. From a distance, palace staff watched the scene, and one quietly remarked, "He still wears the crown, but the power is gone." For hours, his solitude remained unbroken. Once, those steady hands gripped a gilded scepter. Now they rested motionless on a plain oak table, uncertain and searching for direction. Charles had taken the throne as if destiny itself had chosen him, but now he found himself on the outside, quietly sidelined by a transformation that came with no banners, no spectacle, and no unrest. It was complete, yet subtle. What he feared most didn't arrive in a clash, but in a quiet release. As the palace shifted its focus and found a new center of power, Charles was no longer at the heart of royal decisions. Every message, whether within those ancient walls or reaching the outside world, began to pass through William's principal advisor instead. Even the routine updates of the royal household, which had once required Charles's approval, now took a different route. The meaning behind this shift was clear to everyone, unspoken, yet undeniable. There was no need for an official announcement or a constitutional gesture. In reality, the transition was complete. Within hours, Camilla's name vanished from official ceremonial logs for the rest of the quarter, and the events she once led were discreetly reassigned. The public relations staff who had shaped her image were either given new positions or let go. Meanwhile, Catherine's role became the clear center of gravity at the palace. For the first time, a memo appeared with the phrase "Sovereign Representative," a title never before given to a consort, right at the top of the agenda. William's endorsement sat just below. There was no fanfare to announce this change, and no one voiced any opposition. This wasn't just a new phrase, it was authority, quietly reshaped in the day-to-day work. Still, Charles remained silent, his response absent, even as the world moved on. No announcements broke the silence. There were no intimate dinners to explain what had happened. Charles kept to himself, gazing out at the empty space that once pulsed with the presence of a monarch. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, officials began crafting new language to describe the changes. This wasn't called an abdication, not officially, but it was close enough that a new vocabulary was needed. Words like stabilization, realignment, and harmonizing responsibilities. These terms softened the reality, sidestepping the weight of a final separation, and gave those inside the palace some sense of acceptance. At last, alone with his closest aides, Charles let the silence linger before breaking it. His words were quiet, but unmistakable, echoing with resignation. "It is over," he said. "She will carry it now." There was no emotion in his voice. The words did not rise with hope or fall with regret. They simply arrived heavy and long overdue. Charles didn't reach out to Camilla. He didn't call for William. He didn't summon Catherine. He sat with the truth, alone. The man who once led with unshakable composure now settled into isolation, reflecting the stillness that had sealed the council's decision. Yet, this was no longer the calm of control. It was the quiet that comes from surrender. Even as the public waits for official news, the truth inside those walls is clear. The crown's allegiance has shifted, and now it rests with her. Thank you for joining us. If you found this story compelling, please show your support by liking and subscribing. Until next time.